Hello learners, welcome to the 30th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. I'm planning to wrap up our discussion of Zora Neale Hurston's novel Their Eyes Were Watching God. I'll read some quotations from the novel and I'll reflect on this idea of consolation, which I think is a powerful interpretive lens which will help us appreciate not just this novel, but several other novels as well. So I use the word consolation as a way to describe the unique relationship and the unique dialogue that Hurston's novel invites us to imagine and to think about between history as a series of events that have occurred and which individuals don't have any control over. And in fact, individuals don't even have control over how to think about those events. If this is history, if history is a series of unchangeable, unshakable, but also violent events, and events which force us to think about ourselves as subjects in a very constrained manner. If history is a series of intellectual and emotional constraints, then how can fiction or how can a novel, as an act of remembrance, but also as an act of empowering others to remember in particular and empowering ways? If novels and if fiction are to have that educational and ethical role, right? How can novels inspire a new relationship to history? This is a question that I think is important for all novelists, but it becomes particularly important and particularly fundamental for novelists who carry the burden of a particular community, identity, ethnicity, or nation. And this is a question that I believe emerges very powerfully in the work of a very, very well-known novelist, Toni Morrison, whose novel Beloved we will discuss later in this course. But I believe that question can be situated and can be thought of as being articulated very powerfully in an earlier novel as well. And that is the question that I've been thinking about when I read and think about Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And especially this opening chapter where Nanny gives her justification for pretty much forcing Janie's life into a very difficult and what is also going to be, in some ways, violent situation. In a way, this is not new. In a way, this has been true for enslaved, powerless, and in some ways brutalized by history figures that were quite prevalent across American history. And if one looks at slave narratives published in 19th century America, or even fiction, novels by African American women writers, one finds this question articulated again and again and again. And that question is, what kind of a legacy can an African American woman leave for other women, not least her daughter? And this is a particularly ethical and fraught question because of the way the African American body was treated throughout history, but also in the way that the bodies of African American women were treated as the engines or the motors for the reproduction of pretty much the entire global economy, the economy that ran on slavery. So, for instance, the powerful moment that one always thinks about when thinking about these questions is that moment in Toni Morrison's Beloved when one African American woman decides to kill her daughter because she thinks that this death would be a better alternative than to be enslaved. And that is a very powerful moment which we will discuss when we read Beloved. But that moment contains in it, in a sort of minuscule form, the intellectual seeds of this possible dialogue between history and fiction. And in that sense, I'm thinking of the word consolation because consolation, in some ways, does two things. The first thing consolation does, very obviously, is that it establishes the limits of what an individual can or cannot do. Once it has established those limits, it empowers the individual to become ambitious, to try and produce change, to try and break those limits, to try and go beyond what has been thought possible. Now, it's important to note that these two aspects, one can call them the conservative and the radical potential within the larger aesthetic and the ethic of consolation. If consolation has these two elements, then different characters within this novel are entrusted with implementing these two aspects. So, Nanny, I think, carries out some of the conservative work of consolation, whereas Janie carries out the bulk of the more onerous task of the radical aspect of consolation. So I'm thinking about this moment when Nanny talks about her past and explains to Janie the world that existed, the world from which Janie has emerged, the world in which Janie's mother was born, the world that ended, and the new world which Janie inherits. And Nanny's point in all of this is that despite the legal or the theoretical end of slavery, nothing much has changed. And so the kind of instinct for self-preservation that Nanny has inherited from the 19th century world of chattel slavery still holds good, and Janie should inherit that, or at least accept that Nanny has her own best interests while recommending and in some ways enforcing these very, very conservative instincts for self-preservation. So I'll read from this long quote, and chapter 2 is full of such quotes. So I'll take a few minutes to read these quotes and then help understand how the novel both accepts these ideas but also moves far beyond them. Nanny tells Janie in that moment when she's consoling her and explaining her why she should get married to Logan Killix even though she does not want to. So this is Nanny. You know, honey, us colored folks is branches without roots, and that makes things come around in queer ways. You in particular. I was born back due in slavery, so it wasn't for me to fulfill my dreams of what a woman ought to be and to do. That's one of the holdbacks of slavery. But nothing can't stop you from vision. You can't beat nobody down so low till you can rob them of their will. I didn't want to be used for a work ox and brood sow, and I didn't want my daughter used that way neither. It sure wasn't my will for things to happen like they did. I even hated the way you was born. But all the same, I said, thank God I got another chance. I wanted to preach a great sermon about colored women sitting on high, but there wasn't no pulpit for me. Freedom found me with a baby daughter in my arms, and I said I'd take a broom and cook pot and throw up a highway through the wilderness for her. She would expound what I felt, but somehow she got lost off the highway, and next thing I knowed here, you was in the world. So whilst I was tending you off nights, I said I'd save the text for you. I'd been waiting a long time, Janie, but nothing I've been through ain't too much if you just take a stand on the high ground like I dreamed. So this is a somewhat different passage from the one I read out earlier. This is a passage that is already offering glimpse or a very brief glimmer of hope that lies maybe a little way beyond the horizon, but at least that hope is visible. And the hope comes from the idea that Nanny has given up on some hopes, that is, on the hopes that she had for her own daughter first. We'll soon find out that there was a very violent end to that hope. And the way Nanny observes her daughter go through or fall through the cracks of that very, very violent and unfair world that chattel slavery created and which Reconstruction era Florida preserved in some ways, even though Nanny watched her daughter fall through those cracks. And it was precisely the consequence of her daughter falling through those cracks, failing to realize the high hopes and the expectations that Nanny had of her daughter, because her daughter was the first to be born out of slavery, even though her daughter did not realize those dreams. And precisely because those dreams remained unrealized, Nanny has decided to save them for Janie, and says this to Janie not as a way of burdening Janie, but as a way of explaining to Janie that what looks or feels or appears to be a burden now is actually going to lay the foundation for these promises, for these expectations to be realized. So, who can say, finally, those of you who've read the novel will understand that this is a difficult question to answer. Who can say in what ways Nanny constrains Janie, and to what extent what looks like a chain is actually the necessary resistance or the necessary friction that is required for Janie to build the resistant energy, the energy for resistance that this marriage to Logan Killick produces. In a way, that can be said about all of the subsequent relationships, especially the relationships with men after that. It's the resistance that Janie builds, which is in a way the gift that Nanny gives to Janie. And there will be a moment which I hope we can read, but I'll describe it anyway. It is that moment after the death of Joe Stark that Janie finally articulates to herself that Nanny's world was over and Janie was in a different world. That Janie had to struggle and build the strength to struggle and equip herself with the resources for the struggle in a world that Nanny could not have predicted. Despite all of Nanny's good intentions and despite all of Nanny's deep concern and care, and really, I don't think there's anyone who cares for Janie more selflessly than Nanny. Despite all of that, Janie realizes that she's on her own and she has to make judgments. She has to teach herself, train herself in the art of resistance, using the constraints as well as the support that this very new world provides her with. And it takes a lot of suffering, it takes a lot of indignity, it takes a lot of humiliation, it takes a lot of violence that Janie is forced to undergo in these failed marriages. But none of these marriages appear to be failed, or at least have the very obvious signs that they are going to be failed marriages. They don't come with obvious red flags. It takes Janie a process of introspection and realization before she can build the strength to finally break these chains. So in a way, that is the sort of consolation that this novel offers. Janie is constantly reconciling herself to this process of accepting what is right and what is wrong. It's because Janie is very much Nanny's granddaughter that she has to undergo a somewhat long-winded process. Instead of coming straight to the point of accepting that a man like Logan Killick, who expects her to do as much or more physical labor than he does, simply because Janie has a house to sleep under and is not out in the wild, that this is wrong, that this is something she must resist, that Janie must not be grateful simply because Logan Killick has deigned to marry her, that this is a legitimate reaction, that she must preserve herself, that she must take care of herself. And if preserving herself can only be done by abandoning this marriage, by leaving Logan Killick, then she must do this. Janie has to go through her own resistance to accepting that this is what is in fact the right thing to do. And the novel consists of a series of such introspective, intellectual journeys in which Janie continually educates herself in what she must do and what she must not do. And these educations, which ultimately lead her to making these decisions in the favor of self preservation, also come alongside a parallel journey, which is a quest for meaning and a quest for joy. So that moment in chapter 2 when she says she longed to be a pear tree in spring, that longing is repeated throughout the novel. And in fact, I think it's described most powerfully in that long period of mourning after Joe Stark dies. And when she first meets TK and he starts to visit her shop and to make her laugh and simply have conversations, long conversations with her, eventually take her fishing late at night. And these are moments, I think, that the novel describes to us how Janie comes close to recreating that longing that she first had at age 16 when she witnessed that pear tree in spring. Now, whether following that instinct will always align with material comfort, stability, ascendancy in the social ladder, this is not clear. In fact, one thing is very clear, that following that yearning to be a pear tree will always lead to some discomfort. And it is that process of accepting to herself and to explaining to herself and to others around her that these discomforts are worth the risk, that the novel also excels as a document in the self-education. Now, I'll read from the last paragraph of chapter 2, and these are the last words that we hear spoken by Nanny before the novel progresses. And Janie, maybe it wasn't much, but I'd done the best I can by you. I raked and scraped and bought this little piece of land so you wouldn't have to stay in the white folks' yard and tuck your head before other children at school. That was all right when you was little. But when you got big enough to understand things, I wanted you to look upon yourself. I don't want your feathers always crumpled by folks throwing up things in your face. And I can't die easy thinking maybe the men folks, white or black, is making a spit cup out of you. Have some sympathy for me. Put me down easy, Janie. I'm a cracked plate. Very powerful and very moving words, a plea for care from a caregiver. And this is something that we can say has the most lasting impact on Janie's development. In fact, it takes 2 broken marriages. It takes the death of Joe Stark and the long period of loneliness, mourning, isolation, in which Janie reflects on her life and her past. And she accepts that as good as Nanny was, Janie really must, and she owes it to herself to take on that powerful process of self-fashioning. Now, the sentence that opens chapter 3 and the paragraph that follows is probably the strongest and among the most powerful reasons why I'm using the word consolation. I'll read this first. Chapter 3 begins, "There are years that ask questions and years that answer. Janie had no chance to know things, so she had to ask. Did marriage end the cosmic loneliness of the unmated? Did marriage compel love like the sun the day?" So we can see several things going on. The first sentence is philosophical. It seems to have no reference to the real people, the real community or town that's described in this novel. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. It's a very philosophical take on suffering, on not feeling comfortable, on not feeling satisfied. It's a description of how one can live with uncertainty. There are years that ask questions, meaning there will be long periods of time in which nothing will be clear. One will simply be assailed with doubt from all directions. There are years that ask questions. And the sentence ends, and years that answer. So there will simply be times when things will fall into place, and there will simply be other times when nothing falls into place. And then suddenly, immediately after this very abstract and philosophical statement, we are told Janie had no chance to know things, so she had to ask. So, who is she asking this question of? She's asking these questions of herself, of the decision she has made, of the life that she has been forced into in some ways, and she has also been prevailed upon to believe that it is good for her. And so she's asking, what is she asking? Did marriage end the cosmic loneliness of the unmated? Did marriage compel love like sun the day? So the metaphor from the natural world continues because this is when Janie is still very powerfully attached to that experience of observing spring in that pear tree. And the allegorical understanding here is that did marriage compel love like the sun the day? So just like the rising sun produces a series of sensations, reactions, transformations, physiological, chemical, photosynthetic transformations that trigger a sort of evolution and renewal in the natural world, does the cultural act of marriage, does the act of deciding that two people are united in a relationship in a particular way, does that cultural act also have the same kind of power to produce the emotional and the physiological reactions that the sun produces? The answer very clearly is no, right? And it takes a while before Janie is able to accept this refusal and this failure. And it is in this chapter that Nanny asks Janie if she's happy and if everything is going well. And Janie says that she's all right. She's not happy because she thought that she would find love. And she gets laughed at for this because she's told that love means this sort of material comfort and survival. Love means being given the conditions in which one can survive. What Janie is after, it seems or it appears to be too much. Janie becomes, in her own perception of this society that she lives in, the person who seems to want too much. And we know that it is not too much, but Janie at that point is not able to console herself or to accept that it is in fact not too much, that it is in fact very little. And it should be something that everyone should be able to demand and should deserve. But unfortunately, the material circumstances of the world in which they lived made it so that she appears to be greedy and to want too much. So this is how the chapter ends. And the final resolve is not yet here. This is not yet Janie, the person who has decided to break free of all constraints, but we witness the first step in the evolution of Janie's emotional resolve, the evolution in the process which will culminate in Janie taking on abject and absolute isolation as the necessary condition or the necessary risk for personal fulfillment, dignity, and meaning. Janie waited a bloom time and a green time and an orange time, which means that Janie waited for the seasons to change and Janie waited for years to pass for her marriage to improve. But when the pollen again gilded the sun and sifted down the world, she began to stand around the gate and expect things. What things? She didn't know exactly. Her breath was gusty and short. She knew things that nobody had ever told her. For instance, the words of the trees and the wind. She often spoke to falling seeds and said, "I hope you fall on soft ground," because she had heard seeds saying that to each other as they passed. She knew the world was a stallion rolling in the blue pasture of ether. She knew that God tore down the old world every evening and built a new one by sunup. It was wonderful to see it take form with the sun and emerge from the grey dust of its making. The familiar people and things had failed her, so she hung over the gate and looked up the road towards Hay Off. She knew now that marriage did not make love. Janie's first dream was dead, so she became a woman. I'll stop here and take a minute to gloss this last sentence. It actually anticipates several ontological as well as epistemological strands in 20th century feminist thought. The idea that becoming a woman is not simply a biological process, but rather a cultural and an emotional one, by which a community of intellectual and emotional training produces the ideas that eventually inspire people to act in particular ways. This is an idea that is famous in philosophical discourse as coming from the work of the French feminist Simone de Beauvoir, who famously said, "One is not born a woman, but rather becomes a woman." Novelists across the 20th century will revisit and expand and explore this idea in powerful ways. In this novel, we are told that Janie becomes a woman because it's the first time that she has understood the harsh and unshakable reality that many women like her were expected to simply live with. Janie does not simply do that. Janie refuses to accept many of those conditions, and it is that refusal which is told in the chapters that follow, and it is the strength for that refusal that Janie is constantly building. And the story of how Janie builds that strength and the story of how Janie lives with the consequences of that refusal is among the more powerful things about The Eyes by Watching God. I'll make a few comments to wrap this up and continue with the next novel in the next lecture. Thank you.